Imagine a green plain under a pale moon, where the land looks ordinary, until you notice that some hills have edges clean, geometric edges that do not belong to wind or rain. Imagine a pond drained after a dry summer, revealing a vaulted chamber whose walls ripple with long, parallel striations like the wake of oars across stone. Imagine a vast tomb described in an old chronicle as a miniature empire sealed underground, with rivers of quicksilver and a starry ceiling no one has seen for 2,000 years. Now imagine that, in a country famous for careful records, the pages turn and some of these places are barely there at all, or too sacred, or too fragile to open. Before we dive in, if you truly enjoy what I share here, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe, it means a lot. And in the comments, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always fascinated to see this community connecting across the world. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's begin. Suppose the greatest ancient puzzles are not buried under desert glare, but sleep beneath China's soft loess and cedar shade. On the plains around Xi'an, earthen mounds blend into farmland and orchards, their slopes intentionally grassed, their angles softened by centuries. From the ground they pass as hills, from the air they resolve into square and trapezoid, oriented with the cardinal winds. These are imperial mausolea, tomb cities, built of rammed earth and stone, meant to be both visible and hidden. Visible as a promise of order, hidden as a hedge against theft and desecration. The design language is modest and massive at once, like a monarch choosing to whisper so that everyone must lean closer. Far to the south and east, where cast shoulders rise from fields, a farmer once drained a stubborn pond, and the water slid away as if obeying a memory. Underneath lay a chamber, then another, then a honeycomb of chambers, each cut into sandstone with a repeating texture, as if a slow, steady hand had run a comb through the walls. There were no tool piles, no chips of spoil, no hearth ash, no pottery, the kind of silence archaeologists measure with frowns. The emptiness did not feel abandoned, it felt intentional, like a room prepared for someone who never arrived. And west of those chambers, back toward the ancient heartland, the most famous tomb remains unopened. The first emperor's burial mound rests inside a precinct marched by terracotta sentinels, each face different, each palm turned toward the long night. The texts say there are rivers of mercury within and models of palaces, and emplacements to deter intruders with ingenious devices that may have long since fallen still or may not have. Modern teams have mapped the mound with careful instruments and traced faint clues in the soil, then stepped back. Sometimes the most scientific act is restraint, to admit that preservation may demand inaction, that touching a thing to prove its reality may destroy the only reality it has left. These places do not need our fear or our theories. They invite a gentler question. What if the best way to understand them is to move slowly, artifact to artifact, layer to layer, and to accept that evidence, not urgency, must lead? In that spirit, this story will offer the quiet 80%, the clear through lines and durable clues, rephrased and reorganized so they breathe. And then, gently, the added 20%, timelines clarified, terms defined in the plainest words, credible comparisons that show where scholars agree and where they part company. When a claim stands on firm ground, we will say so. When it rests on sand, we will say that too. And listen to how it sounds when the wind moves across it. You may notice a pattern as we walk, light and direction, water and earth. The mounds around Xi'an bend to the compass points as if taking their bearings from the sky. An ancient observatory in the north once caught the sun at solstice through gates of rammed earth, turning the year into architecture. Diagrams of dots and numbers old as legend, tidy as mathematics, map a universe of change, where balance is not a line but a rhythm. Even the subterranean chambers, carved from sandstone, seem to echo that rhythm, their striations steady as a metronome, their volumes sized to support themselves without pillars, without collapse, even after long years underwater. The impression is not of spectacle but of continuity. People aligning themselves to cycles they trusted, building in a language of patience. There is of course a second pattern, stories that arrive without bones or inscriptions, drawing meaning from absence. Some legends are like mist, forming around what we wish were there. They will appear in our journey too, but softly, and only to show how they blur against the ridgeline of what the evidence can bear. The point is not to scoff, nor to surrender to the glamorous pull of rumour, but to use such tales as a kind of negative space, When we look past them, the verified contours sharpen. When we hold them up to the light, they teach us why we are tempted and what we must ask next. Tonight, the pace will be slow. We will let imagery and small, solid facts do the work. The feel of Loess underfoot, the hush inside a cave that once held water for centuries, the cool thought of mercury flowing in darkness like a river that forgot the sun, the neat arithmetic of a magic square that sums to the full moon's number. From each stop, we will lift one question: how do you hide a city in plain sight? How do you carve a room without leaving a mess? How do you keep a world intact by never opening it, and carry that question to the next place like a lantern? If you are drowsy, let the cadence soften your thoughts. If you are awake, let it lengthen your curiosity. Either way, we begin with the landscape itself, and with the hills that are not hills. From a certain height, their lines grow crisp, their hearts reveal themselves, and the pattern under the greenery becomes legible. The lock is the land. Next, we will look for the key. Suppose you are drifting above the Wei River at first light, and the fields below look as they always have rectangles of green, pale roads, the occasional grove until the edges sharpen. A hill squares itself. Another resolves into a low, truncated wedge. What if the plain around Xi'an is not merely farmland, but a carefully made city of the dead hiding in the open? From the quiet of Part 1, we step closer to the mounds themselves. The Western Han emperors and their families shaped this landscape 2,000 years ago, with a grammar of rammed earth, vast, rectangular tumuli, raised by tamping layer upon layer of soil until it hardened like brick, then softened again by planned vegetation, so the monuments would pass, at ground level, as part of the land's natural undulation. Walk beside one, and you feel only the slope and the wind in grass. Rise above it even just to a hilltop or the cabin window of a slow plane, and the geometry declares itself. There are not just a few. Counting imperial mounds and the pyramidal tombs of empresses and kin, scholars map more than 40 major monuments strung around the western and southern outskirts of modern Xi'an, a sacred belt loosely following the river and the line of the old capital. Most remain unexcavated. Together they read less like solitary graves than like a planned terrain. Mausoleum cities, satellite burials, ritual precincts and causeways aligned in deliberate conversation with one another. In a region where natural hills are distant, each mound is a man-made mountain, an axis of memory placed where the floodplain needed relief. The largest of these earthen pyramids belongs to Emperor Wu of Han. Locals call it Maoling. From the ground, it is a broad, grassy mesa. From above, a precise trapezoid whose base spans a little over 200 meters to a side, and whose surviving height rises roughly 47 meters. The mound's scale, more volume than a stadium can hold, is less a boast than a statement of permanence. Accumulated tamped earth resisting time by the simplest means, weight and cohesion. Around it once stood walls, gates, attendant pits, and a mausoleum town, because a Han emperor did not travel to the next world alone. His afterlife was a reduced empire, folded and buried. Not far off, other names whisper from the earth. Changling for Gaozu, first of the Han, Yangling for Jing, Pingling for Zhao, Duling for Xuan, Weiling for Yuan, Yangling for Cheng, and the atypical Beiling, where Emperor Wen chose to be interred not under a pyramid but within a natural mountain to the south, giving the necropolis a second pole. The pattern of placement is not random. Some mounds track the river's course, others appear to keep each other in sight along clear lines across the plain, an architectural way of asserting continuity between reigns. Chinese historiography later gives this alternation of positions a name. On the satellite view, you can feel it without the term. The tombs answer one another across distance. From time to time, this hidden city rises briefly into global attention on a current of rumour. In the 1942nd, airmen reported a colossal white pyramid near Xi'an. Newspaper copy rippled outward. Later writers stitched the tale to photographs that seem, in retrospect, to show familiar Han mounds under romantic captions. Step back from the romance, and the quiet facts remain. The mounds are there. Many were known to scholarship long before the headlines, and their whiteness, when seen, is often the pale face of rammed loess under thin vegetation. Mystery is real here, but it is not the kind that requires a jewel cap or a secret civilization to glow. It is the mystery of purpose made visible and explanation kept modest. Stand on a mound's flank, and the wind bears a second lesson. Orientation. The long sides of many Han imperial tumuli run close to the cardinal directions, north to south and east to west, with tolerances that reflect ancient surveying under real horizons. Others compromise between orientation and view, turning slightly to acknowledge a neighboring mound or a mountain marker. Later texts will group such choices under geomantic thinking. Modern analyses suggest something plainer and older, a politics of sightlines and symbols, in which a ruler's mound faces true north for cosmic centrality, or tilts to keep an ancestor within view, as if to bind legitimacy across generations by lines you could actually draw. If you step inside the visitor centers at a few excavated sites, you find the human scale that makes the mound's abstraction bearable. Miniature terracotta attendants for emperors of the Han, smaller and more domestic than the famous life-size army to the east. Storage pits lined with offerings. The logic of gates and processional ways. But the great interiors of most mounds remain intact, and likely should. Rammed earth can be a fortress or a sponge depending on how you treat it. Cutting into a mound that has held its shape for 2 millennia invites air, water, and microbes into a world built to exclude them. The conservation choice to study from the edges, to model, to map, to wait may feel unsatisfying on a headline, but it is a form of respect both for the dead and for the artifacts that speak for them. For our sleep-soft itinerary, the heart of the matter is simple. These are not anomalies scattered without plan. They are parts of a single, immense composition, made of soil and silence, in which the rulers of an age arranged their afterlives to mirror the order they claimed in life. The plane is the page, the tumuli are the script. To read further, we have to notice what else they notice: the sky. In the next part, we will watch how light strikes Earth at solstice, at equinox, and how a civilization turned that rhythm into the architecture of power. Imagine standing on the shoulder of a Han mound just before dawn, the grass beaded with dew, the plain a quiet slate. Suppose you wait there long enough for the sky to decide, and you begin to notice something simple but exact. Faces turn to the compass, lines that keep company with other lines, mounds that seem to be listening not only to the river but to the pole where the sky turns. What if these tomb cities were not only places to sleep forever, but instruments for reading time, quiet observatories of authority, timing power by the path of light? From the landscape we traced in Part 2, the next step is to watch how intention meets direction. Many Western Han tumuli present themselves as rectangles set close to the cardinal axes, their long sides running north-south and east-west, with the kind of tolerances you get from real horizons and human surveyors. Move your viewpoint a little higher, and other choices reveal themselves. Lines of sight reach from mound to mound. Some pairs appear to keep each other in view across the plain, as if a ruler in death still wished to reside in a court of successors. One emperor, Wen, chose the mountain to the south instead of a man-made pyramid. His peak then became a natural anchor that nearby mounds acknowledge. The result is not a random scatter but a grammar, orientation, intervisibility, and reference points braided together. Why this insistence on direction? In early Chinese statecraft, the cosmos and the court reflected one another by design. The north celestial pole, the stillness around which the rest of the sky appears to turn, was imagined as the purple enclosure, the emperor's celestial palace. On the ground, a ruler facing south presided over an ordered square world, like a human counterpart of the heavens pivot. In later classics, a prescriptive chapter known as the Record of Construction speaks of capitals laid out like a chessboard, 9 north-south avenues and 9 east-west, 3 gates per wall, ancestral temple to the left, altar of land and grain to the right. Whether followed to the letter or not, the ideal radiates through practice. You can feel its imprint in Chang'an's airs and in the necropolis belt around Xi'an. To plan is to align, and to align is to claim the center. If we listen for feng shui, we must be careful with time. The tradition that would later develop form and compass schools, sighting cities by mountains and waters and orienting complexes with a magnetic needle, crystallized well after the Western Han. What we can say with confidence for the Han mounds is simpler and older. They speak a language of the pole and the cardinal winds, and they converse in straight lines across distance. Later dynasties would mix cosmology with compass bearing and landscape form more explicitly. Beijing's imperial core, named the Purple Forbidden City, makes the celestial reference literal. In the Western Han, the message is plainer. The ruler's tomb is a mountain where there is none. The rectangle asserts order. The axis points to a sky that justifies. Does that mean solstice sunrises thread these mounds like beads? The desire to find such neatness is understandable. Across the world, monumental landscapes often court the sun. In China, clear solar architecture does surface earlier, in fact, than many expect. At Taoxi, a late Neolithic walled centre in today's Shaanxi, archaeologists uncovered a semicircular rammed earth platform with a ring of piers that framed narrow slots. When the site was reconstructed and the horizon measured, 2 of those slots proved to catch the winter and summer solstice sunrises, as they would have appeared around 2100 BCE, when the platform was in use. That is an instrument, not a metaphor, a device for turning the year into architecture. It is reasonable to imagine that later builders, raised in a culture that long studied the sky, carried this habit of honouring direction. It is more cautious to say that for the Western Han mounds, the strongest visible pattern is cardinality and sightline, not a geometric net of solar events. There is a second reason to say observatory softly. Power depends on timing, but it also depends on place. A tomb that faces true north proclaims a relationship to the cosmic pivot. A mound that acknowledges an ancestor's mountain or a predecessor's tomb declares continuity. In this, geometry is a language of politics as much as of the heavens. The living court performed that language in processions along straightways and under south-facing eaves. The court of the dead performed it in the way the earth itself was shaped. When you stand on the flank of Maoling or look down along the long side of Changling, what you see is not a star chart traced on the ground. You see the square breadth of a state. Feng Shui's later vocabulary can still help us listen, if we translate carefully. Form Feng Shui values the embrace of mountains and water, the sheltering arm of a ridge. Western Han builders did not write with that vocabulary, but they certainly understood form. Where the Wei River turns, where a natural mountain rises, the mounds, towns, and causeways respond. Compass Feng Shui looks to a needle's north. By Ming times, major axes in the capital align well with magnetic bearings of their day. The Han mounds precede that habit. Their north is the north you feel in your bones when you watch the sky, the place everything else turns around. So we can say this much in a calm voice. The tomb cities around Xi'an are instruments in the sense that a compass rose is an instrument. They set orientation, they bind reins to one another by sight, and they situate authority under the pole. That is observatory enough. When emperors sleep inside earth made square and true, their successors can point to those squares and say, the sky still turns, and we still stand in its centre. From the sky's instructions, the path bends naturally to the most guarded chamber of all, the one no one has entered. In the next part, we descend without breaking the seal, listening for what the soil itself has already told us about a world of rivers that flow without sun. Imagine a door you can measure but never touch. Suppose you stand at first light before a low, grass-softened pyramid on the plain east of Xi'an, and everything that matters lies only a few meters below your feet. An underground sky, a miniature empire, water that moves like a river yet never sees the sun. From the compass true order of the tomb cities, we arrive at the one that speaks most clearly in silence. The mound itself is ordinary to the eye, a geometry of patience built from rammed earth and time. Inside, if the old historian is to be believed, lies a world arranged by a ruler who reorganized all the others. Palaces and towers in careful sequence, a night ceiling pricked with stars, waterways rendered with liquid metal flowing through darkness. For generations that description hovered at the edge of legend, a theatrical flourish in a book of state. Then the ground began to whisper back. Instruments reading the soils above the mound found mercury, where ordinary fields should not. Later, more refined measurements sensed faint traces rising in the air, as if the earth itself were breathing a memory. The story did not turn to spectacle, it simply lined up, softly, with data. The temptation is to go down, to trade rumour for sight. But the first lesson here is conservation, and it is taught in colour. When the painted surfaces on the terracotta figures first met open air, the lacquer beneath their pigments curled and flaked in minutes. Centuries of quiet were undone by a single rush of dryness. That is why the chamber remains closed. Within that room, the balance is delicate humidity, trapped gases, soluble salts, glues and paints that still remember the hands that laid them. Opening the door would not simply reveal, it would change. Archaeology has learned, sometimes painfully, that discovery and loss can be the same act. Waiting, however, is not blindness. The chamber has been read with tools that do not break its skin. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, and other geophysical methods sketch voids and walls in cautious outlines. Surface and satellite surveys watch for subsidence and water, mapping the slow behavior of a mound that is also a building. Even proposals from particle physics have joined the conversation, imagining maps drawn by cosmic ray muons drifting through Earth the way a physician reads a chest without a cut. The emerging plan is not a fantasy city. It is a set of probabilities, refined year by year, that ask us to be as patient as the structure itself. Beyond instruments, law and policy are part of the seal. The site's protection framework places preservation ahead of excavation, and any decision that cannot be undone requires a higher authority than curiosity. There are good reasons on both sides of the long debate. Time and groundwater do their own work. Small movements accumulate. What sleeps in the dark can still be harmed by it. Yet every case study of hurried exposure and the heartbreak of vanished paints leans the balance back toward restraint. The compromise is a slow orbit. Study the precincts, stabilize what is already open, model the unopened world until our ability to keep it equals our wish to see it. There is a gentler angle, best felt at night when the fields are quiet. What becomes of a story that is left intact? If the buried chamber truly mirrors a country stars above, rivers below, then its unentered state has become part of the mirror. It reflects a modern discipline that sometimes chooses not to touch. Patience here is not the absence of inquiry, it is a method. To delay may be the only way to keep an entire world from dissolving the moment it meets the air. Stand again on the mound's flank and consider the larger pattern. The Western Han tombs to the west speak in lines and axes. This older mound answers with the weight of a singular will. Both treat space as a kind of music, counted slowly, set to rhythms of direction and season. Both prefer endurance to spectacle. The emperor who ordered the measure of roads and scripts imagined that measure beneath the ground as well, and 2,000 years later the design still holds. There is, finally, a human scale to all this. The terracotta ranks outside the sealed chamber are not just soldiers, they are a lesson in individuality and sameness, each face distinct, each posture one of thousands. The chamber below is likely to carry that lesson farther, with objects that only survive once. When we imagine a threshold like this, we should also imagine the breath we hold as we decide whether crossing it is knowledge or erasure. Sometimes the best kind of knowing is the kind that waits. From this unopened world we move, still beneath the surface, to a place where a different door once opened by accident. A pond was drained, and stone rooms breathed for the first time in centuries. Their walls carry long, parallel waves, as if rock could remember the motion of a hand. There is no seal to forbid us there, only absence. Next, we listen to the Longyou Caves and the problem of a purpose that left no trace behind. Imagine the quiet after rain, a pond in a farmed valley gathering the color of the sky. Suppose, as in the story, we have just left the unopened chamber that teaches restraint that the next door opens only by accident. Water is pumped away for the sake of land, and the pond does not bottom out into mud, it drops into air. A roof appears where there should be silt. Below it, a room, and then another, each with walls that carry a steady ripple of chisel lines like waves held still. From a sealed world we chose not to enter, we step into one that revealed itself, all at once, because the water let go. The chambers near Longyou in Zhejiang are not natural caverns widened by time. They are spaces cut deliberately from argillaceous siltstone, a fine-grained rock that remembers moisture and dries reluctantly. Most are tall enough to swallow a village hall, their ceilings arched into gentle vaults, their floors flattened, their faces combed with parallel grooves in a calm, repeating course. Some carry their own support, pillars carved from the native rock and left in place like trunks in a felled forest. Some host gutters and trenches that guide water along practical paths. The effect is not rough extraction but careful making. Even in the dimness, you can feel the rhythm of labour in the striations, as if teams agreed on a direction and a width, and held that agreement for every pass of the tool. The discovery, in the summer of 1992, was abrupt. Farmers curious about a set of stubbornly deep ponds cleared them and met stone. 5 chambers emerged first, more followed nearby, until 24 were known a honeycomb without interconnecting corridors, as if each space were meant to be whole unto itself. There is no clear line in the written record telling us when these rooms were cut or for whom. Dating the undated is a slow craft that leans on rock behaviour, rare finds, and the way water and air leave marks. The most cautious estimates put their creation roughly 2 millennia ago. Some analyses suggest a range closer to 23 or 24 centuries. The numbers matter less than the pattern they support: ancient, deliberate, and engineered with attention to how this stone carries weight. One of the first puzzles is not what the surfaces show, but what they do not. When the chambers were dewatered, engineers and geologists were startled by how intact the stone faces were. No field of old cracking, no flaking that would betray long neglect in dry air. The smoothness did not last. Once the rooms were exposed and the rock began to dry, new fissures traced themselves along bedding planes and stress paths. It was as if the water had been keeping a quiet covenant with the stone. A later hypothesis tried to explain the calm interiors this way. Saturated for long periods in slightly acidic water, the siltstone's microcracks may have healed by precipitating new minerals, regaining strength under a chemistry that favored closure. Take away the water too quickly, and the spell lifts. Whatever the precise mechanism, conservation work since the discovery has focused on stabilizing roofs and pillars, monitoring humidity, and learning just how slowly a room like this can be allowed to breathe. Another puzzle is the sheer tidiness. The floors are clean in the way workshop floors are clean, finished rather than raw, with edges that feel intentional. Outside, the landscape does not offer obvious spoil heaps to match the millions of cubic feet that must have been removed. That absence is a question, not a revelation. The rock here breaks to workable sizes and could have been taken away in carts or boats, reused in embankments or foundations now lost to view, or simply spread thin over seasons, so that no single hill tells the tale. The point is not that material vanished into myth, but that purpose often hides its means. Once rock becomes bridgestone, terrace fill or roadbed, it stops reading as spoil and becomes infrastructure. Those grooves the stone waves ask to be read too. It is tempting to call them decorative, but their consistency across walls, ceilings and pillars hints at a discipline wider than ornament. Regular chiseling can control the release of stress, guide the progression of crews, and leave a slightly roughened face that resists spalling. The repetition also unifies the surface visually, turning a quarry face into a finished interior. In some places the grooves bend around a corner or meet a pillar with a neat seam, small clues that the making here was not hasty. In one subset of the chambers, gutters carved along the base of the walls prove that water behavior was part of the plan from the beginning. Rain and seepage were expected, directed, domesticated. What were the rooms for? After 30 years of study by geologists, conservation engineers, and local researchers, the answer still resists a single word. Quarry explains the removal of stone but not the decision to finish and keep the spaces. Storage fits the cool, stable interiors but not the absence of fixtures. Ritual acknowledges the care of the making without attaching a script that the walls themselves do not supply. It may be closer to the truth to imagine a sequence rather than a label. Extraction that left shapes too good to waste. Adaptation into useful rooms. Pride in the craft that turned function into form. Or perhaps the sequence was reversed. Spaces conceived first, with the stone a welcome byproduct carted quietly into the living world. If the sealed emperor taught us to wait, the Longyou chambers teach us to listen for design in absence. No inscription tells us who ordered the work. The tools themselves are present only as a rhythm frozen into stone. Yet the evidence that matters, the way the rock holds, the way water moves, the way grooves repeat, speaks without theatrics. The clean floors, the vanished spoil, the tidy lines all point less to mystery for its own sake than to a purpose we no longer name. Ahead lie explanations that almost fit. In the next part we will hold them one by one: quarry, refuge, ritual, and the sensible mixes between, and see where each seems neatly to the Longyou evidence, and where each leaves a thread hanging. Suppose we carry forward the quiet lessons of the last room, the striations, the gutters, the calm floors, and set them beside the explanations people reach for when a place will not speak plainly. Quarry, refuge, ritual. Each word offers clarity for a moment, then leaves a seam unstitched. What if Longyou is not a single function with a lost name, but a convergence work, shelter, ceremony braided across years, then folded shut by water and forgetfulness? From part 5 we know some anchors. The chambers were carved deliberately in argillaceous siltstone. Their walls and ceilings hold a disciplined texture, like a comb drawn steadily through damp clay. Pillars are native and left in place, suggesting that the makers read load paths and trusted the stone to keep its own roof. In several caverns, shallow channels lead water to the margins, proof that drainage was part of the plan. The rooms stood saturated for long periods. Once dewatered, they began to crack, as if the stone's long companionship with water had stitched microfissures closed. And the sudden dryness undid that pact. These are engineering clues, not myths, and they point to a design sensibility that feels practical before it feels picturesque. Quarry is the first explanation because the rock had to go somewhere. The grooves are compatible with steady handwork, the stone breaks to manageable sizes, the absence of spoil heaps can be answered by reuse. Stone becomes terrace fill, embankment, roadbed, foundation materials that vanish into later landscapes. Yet the neatness of the interiors complicates the label. Quarries are usually read in scars and talus. Here the floors are finished, the walls unified, the gutters intentional. A quarry that kept its rooms would not be unprecedented, but it would be unusual. Perhaps the extraction phase was the beginning of the story rather than its end. Refuge enters because underground space is famously good at keeping people and stores safe, cool and quiet. When we look for analogues, the earth offers many. In Cappadocia's soft tufts, underground cities like Derinkuyu descend in tiers, with stables, presses, churches, and millstone doors that roll to seal passages. The geology there lends itself to branching networks and long corridors. Ventilation shafts stitch levels together like hollow spines. Longyou, in harder stone and with discrete, non-communicating rooms, is a different temperament. Still, the environmental benefits rhyme. Stable temperatures, muffled sound, the ability to hide in plain sight. If these chambers were used as seasonal stores, mustering spaces, or last resort shelter, that would honor their physical logic without forcing them to imitate distant cousins. Ritual is tempting because the making looks like care. Striations that curve neatly around pillars, ceilings that sweep in even arcs, and the very decision to keep the spaces rather than collapse them all suggest pride in craft. Elsewhere, rock-cut interiors take ceremonial form. The mirror-polished granite chambers of the Barabar Hills in India ring like bells. At Petra, facades blossom into tomb temples on the cliff face. In China, Buddhist grottos at places like Longmen and Yungang carry sculpture and paint. Longyou is not those places. No altars remain, no iconography, no platforms for liturgy, but ritual need not mean formal worship. It can mean a culture of workmanship, a habit of finishing, a social rhythm in which the end state of a quarry becomes a venue for something quieter. Cool storage, craft, training, gatherings marked by the feel of stone and the steadiness of light. The flooding timeline softens all three labels. The rooms were not briefly damp. They were deeply wet for long stretches. If the chambers ever held grain, wine, or people, that use must have preceded the water or occurred between cycles of saturation. The gutters hint that the makers expected seepage and rain, not permanent ponds. A plausible sequence emerges. An extraction project lays out a handful of large, regular rooms. Those rooms prove too good to waste and take on secondary lives. Over decades or centuries, hydrology shifts, and the spaces drown. The water preserves the surfaces by a chemistry of patience. Then a modern pump pulls the plug, and the air begins its slow, cracking work. None of this requires a single grand purpose. It asks only for a place to have been useful, then forgotten. Comparisons help, not as proofs but as mirrors. Cappadocia shows how underground cities breathe and defend. Longyou breathes less because it chooses wholeness over networks. Barabar shows how rock can be finished to an austere perfection for an ascetic purpose. Longyou finishes differently, for function first. The shared lesson is that subterranean architecture is a spectrum. Extraction sites that become storage, storage that becomes sanctuary, sanctuary that becomes legend. We do not have to choose a single word if the rock itself suggests a life in chapters. The something else in our title may be the simplest thought of all. These spaces were made by people who balanced effort against benefit under a very local sky. The striations speak of teams and timekeeping. The pillars mark a reading of force. The gutters show a respect for water. If we let those elements guide us, the rooms make sense as work made careful enough to invite reuse. The riddle of the missing debris ceases to be a marvel and becomes the ordinary fate of building stone. The clean floors feel like pride. The silence of the record, while frustrating, is common in places where the work was vernacular rather than imperial. In this hush, another kind of story often tries to enter one that thrives on absence. Spiral scripted discs no museum can produce, translations no archive can verify, a narrative that feeds on the air between facts. In the next part, we will hold that kind of tale up to the light, not to jeer, but to see what it teaches about how legends grow when artifacts do not. Imagine a story that grows whenever you touch it. Suppose you lay out the known facts carefully, like tools on a cloth, and discover that each one dissolves into air the moment you reach for it. No find spot you can visit, no inventory number you can request, no lab notes in any archive. Only a tale about spiral-scribed stone discs said to speak of stranded travelers from the sky. What if the power of the story comes not from what is present, but from what is missing? From Longyou's physical clues, grooves you can trace with your fingertips, gutters that still usher water, we turn to a narrative that refuses the weight of stone. The Dropa discs, as they are usually called, arrive packaged with specifics. A date set in the late 1932, a mountain range on the Sino-Tibetan border, hundreds of circular stones with central holes and spiraling incisions. A scholar in Beijing who deciphers their message after years of lonely, ridiculed work. A museum in Xi'an where 2 discs sit briefly in a case before disappearing. Even a travelling engineer said to have snapped Polaroids. It sounds almost plausible because it sounds almost ordinary. Archaeology is full of quiet rooms, long labours, and artefacts that slip in and out of display. But the test of an archaeological claim is not how neatly it reads. It is whether the evidence can be handled, repeated, and seen. When you follow the threads, names, institutions, journals, the weave falls apart. The Academy of Prehistory in Beijing, sometimes called by other titles, is not a real institution. The scholar who supposedly translated the discs bears a name that does not comport with Chinese naming conventions and leaves no trace in any catalogue beyond this single legend. The expedition leader attached to the discovery likewise vanishes when you look for him outside the story. The supposed museum photographs, when found online in recirculated scans, fail the simplest tests. They do not show the tiny script that gives the discs their charm. They look instead like images of familiar Chinese jade Bai ritual discs, ancient and real, with a hole in the center and sometimes patterned surfaces. Without an object to test, the tale cannot cross the threshold from story to study. There is also the matter of how the legend changes over time. In its earliest printings in little magazines, translated and retranslated, it reads like a curious report from a far place. Later retellings add metal content and strange hums. They add a tribe whose origin is starward. They add a book presented as an expedition diary, complete with photographs and a professor who never taught where he claims. Years afterward, the author of that book admitted it was a constructed hoax, a satire that had escaped its cage. Yet the details it invented seeped back into the Dropa story and hardened there, as if the hoax had salted the earth in which the legend grows. This is how mythology takes on a life. It recruits anything near it that looks like a root. If you set the Dropa tale beside real Chinese archaeology, the contrasts are calming. Excavations in China generate paperwork the way kitchens generate steam. Permits, teams, measured plans, layers of conservation documentation. Even controversial finds are tied to trenches with coordinates and to teams with names you can phone. When an extraordinary claim surfaces, an emperor's unentered chamber that breathes mercury, a Neolithic observatory that catches the solstice sun. There are measurements, peer-reviewed reports, and addresses attached. You may disagree with an interpretation, but you can sit down with the data. The Dropa discs offer only a mirror where any face can appear. It helps, too, to consider the cultural objects that the legend likely leans on. China's long tradition of Bai discs, jade circles with central holes, tenderly worked from the Neolithic onward looks in the vaguest possible way. Like the silhouette in the story, Bai can carry incised patterns, they weather into varied colours, they sit in museums from Xi'an to Beijing to Washington. To someone inclined to read mystery everywhere, a Bai disc in a case can look like the echo of a hoax that mentions a disc. But resemblance is not evidence. In the galleries, those jade circles come with excavation notes, typologies, and science to match the eye. So, what is the lesson here? For sleepy minds that like puzzles but also like things that are true, perhaps it is about how legends assemble themselves from absence. Give a story a mountain range, an untraceable author, a museum that nobody can quite confirm, and a whiff of suppression, and it will grow wherever curiosity meets impatience. The digital age accelerates the process. Each repost sandpapers a claim until it looks smooth, even if it began as splinters. None of this means we should sneer. It means we should practice a tender kind of skepticism, the the sort that remembers how satisfying a perfect circle of narrative can be, and how much more satisfying an artifact feels when it has the stubborn, heavy presence of stone. There is also a kindness in naming a hoax. It protects the real work by giving it room to breathe. When we step back from the Dropa discs, the authentic marvels stand out more clearly. The self-supporting rooms at Longyou, the sealed chamber that breathes a trace of mercury, the rammed earth gate that catches the solstice light. Each of these is strange enough without borrowing wonder from fiction. From stories built on air, we turn to a different kind of legend, one with bones that never stay still in the telling. On a mountainside in Hubei, a rumor of impossible height waits in the mist, stretching biological limits beyond what blood and bone can bear. Next, we will meet the giant that was not there, and learn what belief does to the human frame. Imagine mist lifting from a mountain shoulder, and a tale arriving with it, a skeleton glimpsed in a cave, human in shape but impossibly tall, carried down the slope in whispers and then up into the airwaves. Suppose you try to follow it with ordinary steps. Where was it found? Who documented it? Where is it now? At each turn, the path thins to cloud. No trench report, no accession number, no specimen to weigh. The giant that was said to stand 12 or 15 meters high lives only where stories live. What if the endurance of that story tells us as much about us as it does about bones? From the stone reel puzzles of Longyou, we move to the physics of belief. Giants are old companions in human memory. Nephilim in one tradition, Titans in another, Rakshasa and Jotnar in others still. They measure fear and wonder in the body of a person, and they stride wherever landscapes feel too large to be humanly made. That universal motif makes a fertile field for modern rumours. In one decade, a photograph circulates of soldiers unearthing a colossal skeleton in a desert. The image turns out to be a contest manipulation, an elephant dig reworked with clever shadows. In another, 19th century clippings describe outsized bones from burial mounds and caves. Deeper reading shows mismeasurements, eroded contexts, or Ice Age animal remains mistaken for human. A century later, a headline claims that a national museum admitted to destroying evidence of giants. The admission dissolves under scrutiny into satire misquoted as news. The pattern repeats: an extraordinary claim, a borrowed image, a vanishing artifact. There is a calmer scale at which the body truly stretches. Robert Wadlow, whose medical records and photographs are plain, reached 2.72 meters before his death in 1940, a height driven by pituitary hyperplasia that flooded his system with growth hormone. Even at that scale, less than 3 meters weight, joint stress and circulatory strain make movement a negotiation. Muscles must lift more mass, knees and ankles carry loads far above what their geometry evolved to bear. The heart must push blood to a brain farther above the pump than usual, and the valves in the legs must defy gravity over longer columns. Gigantism is real, and sometimes tender to witness, but it is also fragile. Now turn the thought experiment outward, up into the impossible numbers that the Mufu mountain rumour loved. The square cube law waits there with a cool hand on the shoulder. As a body scales up, its mass rises with the cube of its height, while the strength of bones set by cross-sectional area rises only with the square. Double a person's height, and the load on each limb outpaces the limb's ability to resist it unless the bones thicken disproportionately, producing a creature so massively boned and muscled that walking becomes a slow labour. Lungs must draw enough oxygen through a surface that has not kept pace with volume. The heart must generate pressures that human vessels cannot tolerate. Heat must be shed from a surface that has not grown fast enough to cool what is within. The physics does not mock the myth. It explains why such bodies do not walk our slopes. Paleontology offers real giants, but not in our image. Gigantopithecus blacki, known from mandibles and teeth in cave deposits in southern China and Southeast Asia, was an enormous ape likely over 2 meters when standing upright if it did, and massively built, but no biologist argues that it reached the heights of legend or that it belongs in our lineage. In Indonesia, fragmentary remains labelled Meganthropus have a long history of reclassification and debate, often settling back toward robust Homo erectus rather than some parallel human colossus. Where the fossil record is firm, the picture is humbler. Many hominins larger or smaller than us, none a 4-story neighbour. Where the record is thin, the scientific answer is not, therefore giants, but therefore we do not know yet. So why does the giant persist? Partly because the mind is kind to stories that heal a gap. A vanished skeleton resolves a tension between the monumental and the human. How could people move those stones? Raise those walls, carve those chambers. Perhaps, says the tale, they were larger, partly because photographs and headlines are easy to remix into authority, and partly because the myth does something gentle. It lifts the ordinary person into a world where the scale of our questions matches the scale of the landscape. A 12-meter ancestor is a way to make awe visible. Skepticism need not be harsh. A tender skepticism asks for what any honest object would give: a provenance, a measurement, a chance to look again. If a claim lacks those graces, it does not mean the desire behind it is foolish. It means the desire should be redirected toward wonders that hold still when we touch them. There are enough of those to keep us busy: rooms combed into stone that remember the motion of the hand, a sealed chamber that breathes a trace of mercury into morning air, a ring of earthen gates that still catch the solstice light. Standing back from Mufu Mountain, the slope returns to mist and trees, and the rumour returns to its work of roaming. In its place we can put something sturdier, the way scale actually behaves under gravity, the way bone and blood carry loads, the way myths mark the edge where evidence ends. If the physics of belief teaches anything, it is that stories grow tallest where the ground is soft. Firm ground looks different. It looks like walls that fit without mortar and somehow stay standing when the earth shakes. Next, we will go there, to a city that flexes instead of breaking interlocking faces of stone, dry as bone, that ride the tremor rather than resist it. If giants belong to fantasy, resilience belongs to craft, and craft, unlike rumour, leaves joints you can run a fingertip across. Imagine a wall whose strength is the hush between stones. Suppose you approach an old rampart at dusk. No mortar seams, no shiny binders, just faces of rock fitted so closely that a fingertip finds only hairline shadows. When the earth moves, this wall does not brace itself like a clenched fist. It loosens its shoulders and rides the tremor, then sighs back into place. What if resilience lives not in glue, but in the small, deliberate freedoms of the joints? From the giant who was not there, we return to craft, that is. In the south, travellers still speak of a lesser-known ruin, Guluo, where courses of stone were stacked dry and locked by geometry rather than paste. The documentary chain is thin, and careful eyes should take the site's proudest claims as local memory first, evidence second. Yet the idea those stones embody is both ancient and testable. In seismic country, well-made dry masonry can be forgiving in ways stiff walls are not. The secret is that nothing is truly rigid. Gravity is patient, friction works like 1,000 tiny breaks, and the minuscule gaps between faces become the space where energy spends itself instead of shattering edges. Look closely at a good dry wall and you read a grammar of intention. Faces are tool to meet over broad contact. Beds are set with a slight inward lean, so vertical loads press the stones into the hill, not off it. Through stones stitch veneers to cores. Keys and shims fill the last slivers so stress spreads rather than knives. The result is neither a puzzle nor a pile. It is a fabric. Under shaking, individual blocks rock, slide a breath, and settle. That motion so small it looks like stillness dissipates energy. Where cemented joints may crack and transfer shock to the next stiff spot, dry joints slip a little and spare their neighbours. After, you straighten what moved and the wall lives to see another season. China's own traditions give this logic more than one language. Earthen builders learned to tilt and thicken walls, to stage weight, and to crown with forgiving timber. The great Hakka earthen houses Tulo are not stone and not dry, yet they survive because their mass is continuous and their tops are elastic, heavy cylinders of rammed earth banded and tied by wood. In testing and in quakes, they trade brittle failure for ductile sway. Timber palaces push the idea farther. Interlocking bracket sets dugong do not glue beams together. They grip, wedge, and release, turning violent shaking into layered sliding and controlled rattle. Different materials, same lesson. Let the structure breathe. If you prefer numbers to metaphors, the experiments are kind. Researchers who subject dry stone assemblies to cyclic loading. Record hysteresis loops wide enough to show real energy loss. Finite element models that allow joints to open and close, reproduce what masons long ago learned by hand. Block shape and bond pattern matter more than raw weight. Batter and through stones slow down damage. A little movement now prevents a lot of breaking later. Manuals from other mountain countries echo the same. Band the corners, step the courses, knit the faces, except that the wall must be allowed to move. So where does a place like Guluo, whatever its exact dossier, fit within China's longer story of making cities stand. For many centuries, the default urban wall was not stone at all. It was rammed earth, compacted layer by layer until it behaved like a single body. In dry climates, it became almost stone itself. In wet ones, it needed brick jackets and regular care. When brick and stone did take a greater share, their best iterations in seismic provinces quietly borrowed dry masonry virtues. Thicker sections, slight incline, heavy copings that clamp the courses below, timber bands that tie corners, details that trade a little precision in alignment for a lot of survival in motion. The philosophy is consistent across materials. Stiffness can be bought too dearly. Strength is what remains after shaking, not what looks impressive on a calm day. And the claims about earthquakes? Here the fairest tone is modest. A dry wall does not become impervious, it becomes graceful under duress. It may shed a few stones like leaves, it may need hands afterward to coax it back to crispness. But its failure, if it comes, prefers to be incremental and repairable. That, for people who must live with quakes, is the difference between a scar and a ruin. Where stories say a southern wall rode out a tremor while newer concrete cracked, the physics is plausible even if the footnote is absent. Brittle systems store strain and announce it all at once. Systems with joints spend it as they go. Stand, then, beside any well-fitted dry course, whether in a field terrace, a village gate, or a quiet ruin, and feel what it offers to sleep and to thought. This is engineering as temperament. Nothing is excessively tight. Every contact is generous. The whole trusts the parts, and the parts are allowed to adjust without panic. When the ground reminds the wall that the world moves, the wall answers, I know. From stones that flex to ideas that flow, the path ahead turns from mechanics to meaning. Some of China's oldest diagrams speak a language of balance and change as elegant as any masonry dots on a turtle shell, numbers in a square, water and fire kept in cosmic proportion. Next, we will trace those quiet patterns, the river map and the Luo diagram, where the instructions are not hammered into stone, but shimmer in numbers that always add up. Imagine a pond under moonlight so still that dots of starlight seem to rest on its skin. Suppose you lift that image and set it beside a turtle's back, a lattice of scutes like tiny windows. Then add the whisper of an old tale of a dragon horse rising from the yellow river, of a sacred turtle surfacing on the Luo, each bearing a pattern that looked less like a picture than a set of instructions. What if those patterns were not answers at all, but instruments made to be tuned, played, and retuned as the world moved? From stones that flex and survive, we step into diagrams that flex and explain. The He Tuesday and the Luo Shu are not large objects. They live in the small space where dots become numbers and numbers become relations. Tradition says the He Tuesday, the river map, showed paired points, dark and light, odd and even, grouped into fives that echo water, fire, wood, metal, earth. The Luo Shu, the Luo diagram, resolves into a neat 3x3 square, carrying the numerals 1 through 9, so that every row, column, and diagonal sums to 15. Hold the square in your palm and you feel the deep calm of its balance, a center anchored by 5, corners that answer one another, edges that trade weight like breath. It is both very simple and very hard to exhaust. Legends place these diagrams in an antiquity beyond dates. Texts give them voices later, when scholars begin to braid myth and method. That braiding matters. A culture that watched the pole star to set its bearings also watched seasonal change in flood and drought, wind and heat, and tried to think those changes into order. In that effort, the He Tuesday and Luo Shu worked not as proofs but as tools for thinking. They suggested how opposites could meet and borrow strength, how directions could carry qualities, how cycles could be pictured without being trapped. In some hands, the dots and numbers became a grammar for mapping the cosmos. In others, they shaped decisions about city plans, altars, and the choreography of courts. If you are wary of metaphors, begin with the plainest meaning. A magic square is a small machine that makes equality out of difference. Sum any line, and you get the same reply. Shift the numbers around their rules, and the reply remains. In a world where calendars were measured by shadow and horizon, such a square could model steadiness and change at once. The total does not feel the shuffle, yet the placement matters to the eye. The river map performs a cousin task in a different style, setting pairs and directions so that the movement of seasons and elements can be spoken through number. Read this way, the diagrams are not talismans. They are ways of holding many moving parts in the mind at once, the way a musician holds a key while listening for the notes that want to follow. Later thinkers drew the trigrams of change, the broken and unbroken lines, into circles that echo these older patterns. Arrangements of the 8 signs could be set to favor stillness or motion, early or later heaven. The squares could seed flight paths for numbers that stood for winds and rains, doors and stars. In private study and in state ritual, the point was constant, to find a shape that let human action rhyme with the larger rhythms of sky and earth. A ruler's south-facing throne and a city's north-south avenues belong to the same family of thought as the dots and numbers, placement as an ethical act, orientation as a kind of promise. Because the diagrams are small, they travel easily. They slip into medicine as ways of remembering flows and balances, into architecture as rules of thumb for siting and sequence, into poetry as structure and play. Read too literally, they can harden into superstition. Read too abstractly, they dissolve into trivia. Their power lies in the middle distance, where pattern is not a cage but a lens. Look through the grid and you see a world that breathes. Yin leaning into yang, fire tempered by water, a month moving toward its full 15th night and then away again, all while the total remains complete. There are cautions. The diagrams are not blueprints from a single founding hand, nor are they secret proofs of a lost physics. Their earliest mentions are woven into texts that argue about many things at once. The eloquence that later ages find in them is not a single thread pulled from a sealed chest, it is a tapestry repeatedly rewoven. When modern writers claim exact, ancient dates or one-to-one correspondences with every later art, they flatten a history that is more like weather than like a monument. Better to let the patterns be what they are, durable metaphors with enough mathematical backbone to stand, and enough openness to invite new readings. If you hold the Luo Shu long enough, you notice something gentle. The number 5 center refuses to be grand. It simply steadies the others. In a similar way, the diagrams themselves refuse to shout. They whisper that balance is not stasis but motion organized, that a map can be both instruction and invitation, that a culture can be rigorous without being rigid. At night, laid on a table by lamplight, the dots and numbers look like a lake catching stars or a shell remembering rivers. This, finally, is why they belong with the walls and mounds, the caves and gates. Each is a different way of rehearsing the same discipline. Align with what lasts, accommodate what moves, make room inside the form for the tremor that will surely come. The He Tuesday and Luo Shu offer that discipline in miniature. Their size is part of their mercy. You can carry them. From diagrams that hum with balance, we go next to a circle of earth that turns light into a calendar. On a plateau far to the north, 13 slots in a rammed earth ring catch the sun as it walks the year. If the Luo Shu makes time visible on paper, Taosi makes it visible on the horizon. We will stand there at dawn and watch the day begin. Imagine the Luo Shu square from the last part, set out on a table by lamplight numbers breathing in balance, and then imagine lifting your eyes to find the same calm order written across a horizon. Suppose the paper diagram becomes a ring of earth, and the ink becomes sunlight. On a high plateau in northern China, before bronze smoke, before written calendars, a circle of rammed earth with 13 narrow slots watch the year walk past. What if power, long before palaces and bronze seals, began with knowing exactly when the light would arrive? Taosi sits today like a faded fingerprint on the plain, walls leveled by time, foundations hushed, the wind combing through dry grass. 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, it was a planned settlement of timber and packed earth, a place that gathered labor and authority in one walled bowl. Near its heart, archaeologists uncovered a semicircular platform of rammed earth almost 60 meters across, fronted by an arc of 13 slim gates or piers with slits between them. The arrangement looks austere until you stand in the right place, at the right dawn. Then the slits are not openings, they are instructions. As the sun lifts along the horizon through the seasons, it threads the year into the structure, winter sunrise by one slot, summer by another, equinoxes caught between turning months into angles and time into architecture. This was not a toy of priests. For a farming society, the calendar is food, and food is survival. To track the sun's farthest standstill, to know when it turns back, to mark the midpoints and the quarter points, is to place sowing, transplanting, and harvest in a rhythm that matches rain and heat. It is also to claim legitimacy. In early Chinese thought, the order of the court and the order of heaven mirrored each other. A leader who could name the day when light would return performed alignment, not just astronomy, weaving human plans into the larger fabric of the sky. The 13 slots at Taosi read as a machine that served both bread and mandate, a calendar you could stand inside. Stand there in thought at winter solstice, breath white in the pre-dawn air. The eastern rim is a cold line. Then the disk tips up, exactly where last year and next year it will tip up again, caught between two earthen posts by a slit less than the width of a palm. A watcher nods. A drum may sound. Someone records the sighting with a pebble moved on a board or a notch on a stick. The act is simple. Its consequences ripple through fields, storehouses, and the speech of rulers. Around the platform, the archaeology is not silent. In the same precinct, teams found traces of ritual: a large stone drum whose skin was the earth itself, pits with animal bone and carefully broken pottery, burials that graded rank by grave goods and labor. A complex hierarchy lived here, one that expressed itself in music, sacrifice, procession, and the careful maintenance of walls. The observatory belongs to that choreography. It is not a solitary instrument. It is a stage for measuring, and for being seen to measure. To hold the calendar is to hold the hinge of the year, and people gather around the hinge. Debate survives, as it should. Some argue about the exact range of dates when the device worked best, given the slow tilt of Earth's axis and a local horizon that may have changed contour over centuries. Others ask whether all 13 slots were for solstices and equinoxes, or whether some served intermediate markers, points in the year that later traditions would count among the 24 solar terms. The careful voice says this: at minimum, the device tracks the sun's extreme risings and the balance points between. Everything further is plausible in spirit and cautious in detail. The larger insight is steady. Before ink and before metal, people at Taosi made the sky legible by earth, then used that legibility to pace their society. There is a tenderness to the engineering. Rammed earth is strong when compacted in layers. The platform's mass does not defy gravity so much as befriend it. The slots are narrow enough to be precise and wide enough to survive. The observing stance is implicit in the layout. You do not need a lens or a tube, only patience and a clear line. In this, Taosi is kin to other early instruments of light and shadow, the gnomon and its noon mark, the notch on a ridge used by shepherds, but it scales the idea up to the size of a town and gives it permanence. Time becomes a public square. Power ends where knowledge thins. At some point, Taosi faltered, whether by drought, by conflict, by shifts in trade or authority, and the drum went silent. The slots watched empty air, then they watched nothing at all as the structure slumped and soil drifted over. When the schedule that once bound human acts to the sun is broken, the fields lose their metronome and the rituals lose their cue. If power began in knowing when dawn would arrive, it might well have unraveled when those who knew were gone. Yet the instrument still teaches. It says that calendars are not only numbers written after the fact, they are behaviors enacted in place. It says that the oldest science may be the kind you do with your body, standing, waiting, watching a horizon. And it says gently that meaning and measurement are not enemies. The same slot that marks solstice marks the moment when a community breathes together. One more glance down the ring at dawn, the slit filling with fire, the long shadow of a post reaching back over packed earth, and then we will close our walk. In the quiet that follows, we will gather the books and papers that steadied these hours, laying them out like stones in a path for any listener who wants to return by daylight.